of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Woody Allen once said, "I wish God would give me a sign. A large deposit in my name in a Swiss bank account would suffice." That kind of sign would be a nice sign to get, wouldn't it? And often our desire for signs is a desire for things which actually suit us. Sometimes it's the sign that we want itself. My wife and I have recently bought a house, and it was the end point of 6 months of looking around. My wife Narelle spent about 6 months researching, working very hard. And when we first saw the place that we've now bought, I walked out into the backyard, and there was this huge jacaranda tree there. And I'm a big fan of jacarandas, they're my favourite tree. In fact, my wife would say that I've got something of an obsession with jacarandas. I introduced her to my favourite jacaranda tree in Sydney a few years ago and made her walk in to see it from 5 different angles. So when I saw this jacaranda tree, I smiled to myself and thought, is this God's sense of humour? Is this a sign that he wants us to buy this house? How do we work out whether we're seeing a sign? How do we work out whether this is a sign from God or whether it's just something that we want? I know a few people who have got married on the basis of signs. They've met someone, there's been so many coincidences, so many things that they have in common with this person that they've taken it that this must be a sign from God. It's only years later when things have got hard or things haven't worked out that they've asked the question, was that really a sign or was that just me projecting what I wanted? How do we see signs? How do we know whether it's really a sign or whether it's just what we want? Say, for example, I was driving to an appointment. I'm running late, and so I say to myself, I say to God, I really need to be here on time, and if you give me a sign, then I'll slow down, but apart from that, I'm going to speed to get there. And you turn the corner and you drive past a big sign saying 50 kilometres per hour. And so you say to God, okay, well, if you give me a sign that's out of the ordinary, then I'll slow down. And a fox runs out in front of your car. And so you say to yourself, now God, if you send a kangaroo, sometimes we can actually use signs as an excuse to not do something that we don't want to do. Or sometimes we can use signs as, well, it's actually the sign itself that we're after. Imagine I was facing an exam tomorrow, and I thought to myself, well, I haven't studied for this, and I guess I do deserve to fail. But God, if you help me to pass, if I pass this exam, then I will know that you're real. Is it that we want to know that God is real, or is it that we want the sign itself? The problem is that we always have mixed motives. We all have mixed motives, and we bring these mixed motives to our desire for a sign. The people who saw Jesus' signs were in the same boat. These signs that Jesus did were pointers to things about him, who he was, or the things that he could do. And the first of our signs that we saw was Jesus turning water into wine. And then the next week we saw that Jesus went to the temple and he cleared out all the people who were earning money there. He cleared all the merchants out of the temple. And the week after, we saw last week that Jesus healed a man who'd been paralysed for 38 years. And people started to follow him as a result. But they brought their mixed motives with them. And we see them very clearly in this passage. Let's take another look at lines 2 to 4. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. These people were following Jesus not because they understood who he was, not because they understood what he was going to do, but because their felt need was sickness. They were sick. They knew people who were sick. And so they brought those mixed motives to Jesus. Now we're all going to have mixed motives. That's unavoidable. But when it becomes a problem is when we're unwilling to look where God points us, because that's not what we're after. We see that happened to this crowd at the end of this passage. Look down at line 29. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. One of the mixed motives that people brought to Jesus and saw his signs from was that they wanted freedom. They weren't a country like Australia who elected their own prime minister. They were ruled over by the Romans. First century Jewish Palestinians who lived in Palestine were ruled by, they were just a colony of the superpower of the day. And what they wanted, perhaps most of all, was freedom. Freedom to follow their God as they wanted. Freedom to exercise their choice. And they saw in Jesus a man who could do that. This man was able to feed thousands of people. If they could just start a rebellion now, if they could catch Jesus up in that rebellion, then Jesus would have no choice. He'd have to run with it. If they could make him the leader of a rebellion, then the circumstances would take over. What they did was they came to Jesus with mixed motives, and it became a problem when Jesus pointed them to a place other than where they wanted to go. Well, the next day, after this happened, the crowd manages to find Jesus, and they come to him, and he points out another mixed motive of theirs. Jesus answered, I tell you the truth, you're looking for me, not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. They had a very powerful motivation that they brought to Jesus, a desire for food. People today, people back then, brought mixed motives to Jesus. 14 years ago, I had a Copernican revolution in my life. I don't know if you've heard, I'm sure you've heard of Copernicus. He was the guy who said that the sun was at the centre and the earth revolves around the sun. Everyone else was thinking that the earth was in the centre and the sun was revolving around it. And I had a Copernican revolution 14 years ago. My realisation was that I am not the centre of the universe. You guys already know that, because you're the centre of the universe, aren't you? My realisation 14 years ago was that God is the centre of his universe. I'm not the centre of his universe. And the same is true with these signs. God is the reason for these signs. God is at the centre of these signs. These signs aren't given for our sake. They're given to make a point about God. Often we have our signs, we're looking for signs because we want to know what decision does God want me to make? What does God want me to do? And when God starts talking about himself, we're disappointed. With this sign, God was talking about himself. Well, let's take a closer look at this sign. Line 18 tells us a little bit more about it. There's a crowd that's gathered that numbered 5,000 men, with the addition of women and children, probably more like 20,000. This crowd had followed Jesus. They'd actually followed him across a lake, the Sea of Galilee. These days, the other side of the lake is the Golan Heights. And so Jesus and his disciples had withdrawn to this place to get a bit of rest, to withdraw from the crowds. But the